buried line at dusk. He spat handfuls of dry sand from his mouth and pressed his forehead harder against the rim of packed earth as a calloused hand tapped a tolly stick nearby. Fear tightened his throat and ordered his hands to still. He kept his eyes on the horizon and did not beg. The field warden stepped down the line, wooden tolly in one hand, inked slate in the other, and said the names out loud as if reading grain prices. The thin man under the dirt, the unnamed prisoner, felt the word fear as a pressure behind his ribs and measured every small movement to avoid drawing attention. The narrator recorded the event with the same flat cadence used for shipment counts. The documentary narrator wrote details. The pit dimensions, the rope loop used to steady heads, the placement of bait pouches at the rim. Those notes belonged to procedure. They framed the immediate conflict. Prisoners buried to the neck were left to die slowly by heat, insects, and neglect. That legal framing made the warden's choices readable. It did not make them less deliberate. The prisoner had been dragged from a market stall 3 days earlier. He had been selling a clay bowl and a string of beads when men with ledger seals hauled him away. The warden had run a finger along the tally marks on his forearm before the transport, as if checking inventory. On the walk to the field, the prisoner clutched a bead on its cord until the skin on his thumb whitened. The narrator included that detail because small actions mattered. The bead's dent in a thumb would later mark a corpse. The field warden set the wooden tolly across his knee and tapped to mark a man, he said. A man, last work order. His voice did not rise. He did not raise his gaze to the buried heads. The prisoner moved his jaw and tried to call a name. Only a cracked sound came out. He could not force more than one consonant. The warden did not look back. The warden's assistant arrived with a sealed parchment and a wax emblem. The narrator noted the wax, the emblem's jagged edge, the way the assistant handed the parchment without speaking. The arrival was an external event that shifted the scene. New orders, a new specification. The assistant placed the parchment on a flat stone near the makeshift tent and waited with his head bowed. The warden broke the wax with a small knife and read aloud, as procedure required, the words that altered a man's fate. Leave number 8 for display, the warden, sounding at once bored and bureaucratic, orders from the magistrate. He will be kept alive for the procession. He did not ask for objections. The prisoner at pit 8 heard his name spoken and started to cry out. He spat more sand and his lips cracked around the sound. The assistant looked toward the prisoner, but the warden tapped the tally and shrugged. The first emotion shift ran through the prisoner. From focused fear to stunned humiliation. He stopped measuring his breaths and instead searched the warden's face for reason. He tried to make his voice into talk, why me? He forced the words short and raw, why me? The warden answered with a rotation of his jaw and a single sentence that functioned as a doctrine. Because the magistrate wants a lesson, the warden, because spectacle keeps order. Because names count and your living will mark the day, the village watchers murmured and some spat into the dust. The prisoner tightened his fingers around the bead until the cord cut skin. Pain registered, and the prisoner breathed shallow to distract himself. The narrator wrote the next details with clinical distance. He recorded how the warden had the prisoner's rope restraints retied higher and how a shallow pouch of sugar and meat bait was scattered on the rim to invite flies. He listed birds and beetles observed in the field notes. Those reports were precise. They were also the instruments of cruelty. Deliberate steps to speed infection and torment. In the third sentence after the assistant left, a gust of wind rolled thin sand into the pits and the prisoners cuffed. The external event accelerated tension and forced immediate decisions. The prisoner tried to move his head aside to keep sand from clogging his mouth. His neck resisted. He had been packed too tight. The warden walked to his post and, without looking directly at him, tightened the final knot of the rope. Stay still, the warden, you will teach them patience. The line of prisoners inhaled at once. A chorus of thin breaths rose like a shallow wave. The second emotion shift arrived in the prisoner as a small, fierce clarity. Fear stayed, but beneath it something else took root. The need to be a witness. When he could no longer speak loudly, he tried to etch an occurrence into the soil with the heel of his hand, scraping a shallow mark at the pit rim. The warden caught the motion and slapped the rim with the back of his hand. "No marks," he said. "No proof beyond the tolly." The prisoner stopped, hand trembling, and set his jaw as if to store the motion inside himself. Voices exchanged across the pits. The documentary narrator quoted a fragment from a survivor's confession that had reached him earlier. "They took my sister at dawn. The cord burned her neck, and the beetles ate the scab." The prisoner wept quietly and repeated the words to himself like a litany. The warden called once more, reading aloud the legal phrasing that had sent men here. For crimes against the levy, thus prescribed, the assistant marked another tally. At dusk the insects thickened. Flies landed and gathered on lashes, on the wet fold where skin met dirt. The warden pushed a small pouch toward the rim and tilted it so the bait spilt. Black wings rose and settled. "They will not last the week. The warden, we do not hurry them." That is the point. The narrator described the bait and the flight of the flies as if cataloguing a specimen. Dialogue took on the form of negotiation and accusation. The prisoner said, "Field warden, I was only selling a bowl." His line was short. "Field warden, a man hadn't he money?" The warden answered with a clipped list. "To the unpaid, name on register." Magistrate signed. The assistant added a peripheral fact. Ammon spat at the bailiff in the market. That exchange created a small confrontation of 3-6 rapid lines in which names and reasons were hurled like ledger entries. The warden's voice stayed low. "A man," he said to the prisoner, reciting the tally, "you will mark tomorrow's procession." The prisoner forced his shoulders to rise and fall with the rhythm the warden set. He held his eyes on the horizon and counted the pigeons to keep his pulse from breaking into cries. The documentary narrator recorded the pigeons because simple, concrete things anchored testimony. Night fell thin and a sand-laden wind pushed across the field. The first gust of the storm came while villagers argued at the tent edge and a distant dog barked. An external event, the squall, arrived and the scene shifted violently. Sand came over rims, and the prisoner coughed, drawing grain into his mouth. The warden's assistant shouted and rushed to batten down the tent. The warden watched the prisoner struggle and did not move to help. The climax reached its peak when the sand heaped into the pit rim and covered the prisoner's nose. He inhaled grit and summoned a single, raw sound. The crowd at the field edge yelled and a woman ran forward calling for mercy.
"Pull him free!"
she cried. "Pull him free, please!" The warden answered with a single decision. He drew the tally stick closer, glanced at the magistrate's wax, and signaled the assistant to leave the tent closed. The assistant paused, looking torn. A rapid exchange followed. "Field warden," the assistant said, voice tight. "The woman begs." "Do we follow order?" The warden replied. "We follow order, but he chokes." The assistant said, "Let me loosen." "No." The warden's "no" ended the argument. That string of short lines, 3 quick back and forths, forced the assistant to choose and made the assistant's decision a turning point. He stepped back and let sand bake into the man's mouth. The prisoner tried to pull his head free, and the rope scraped his neck. His hands found the bead, and he bit the cord until the bead fell into the dirt. That small loss became a new fact to remember. He thrashed, and sand clogged his lips. The warden began marking the death in his ledger with a dull precision, not looking at the face of the man suffocating at his feet. The documentary narrator kept phrases short. Tally mark, ink line, wax pressed. A short, sharp twist came when the assistant, who had been tallying silently, paused, then slipped a folded scrap of cloth under his arm and walked to the tent flap. He returned with a name list and hesitated at the warden's side. "Field warden," he said. "The magistrate's order also includes a clause about spectacle lengthening the lesson." The warden glanced at the folded cloth and at the still heaving face in pit 8, and gave a precise look that froze the assistant's motion. The assistant stepped back and resumed marking. The revelation recontextualized the magistrate's parchment. Public humiliation, not mercy, had been the purpose. Dawn crawled in grey. The last breaths left the pit in small, wet exhalations. The warden recorded the final note the way he would note grain loss. Died at first light, he wrote, dipping his stylus. The prisoners coughed and turned their faces away. Others swallowed. The documentary narrator listed this as closure for the individual count and as acceleration of the field's tally. After the death, the warden removed the rope with a mechanical motion. He rolled the corpse onto its side and tied a simple twine to the bead, which had come to rest under a clod of dirt near the pit edge. He dropped the bead into a small pouch and placed it beside the tally stick. The assistant bent and collected the bead with fingers that betrayed no tremor. The prisoner who had been assigned to pit 9 watched and clenched his jaw. The emotional shift there moved from dread toward a colder resolve. A witness preparing to store facts for later retelling. The narrator closed the chapter of the day's work with an image tied to ritual. A cracked clay bowl half buried near the field's edge, and a candle guttering in a small iron cup. That still life was described concretely: soot on the rim, a bead in a pouch, fresh sand on the bowl's lip, and used to tie the page back to records and rights. The surviving prisoners shifted in their constraints, and the warden made another tally. The assistant walked away with the pouch, and the bead, and the warden nodded to him once. "Keep the bead," he said. "It proves the order was carried out. It proves the magistrate's hand." The assistant kept the pouch pressed to his chest. The chapter ended not with speech to an audience, but with an action in the field. The assistant walking toward the magistrate's tent to deliver the pouch and the tally, the bead held like a ledger token. That delivery was a concrete beat, a decision moved across the field that would feed the next day's records. The narrator wrote the final line as a fact. The bead was handed to the magistrate's clerk, and the tally mark was set into the ledger, black ink drying under a flicker of guttering flame. The last sentence closed with a concrete sound, the slap of the ledger's cover closing, and a single small motion that carried the scene forward. The magistrate's clerk lifting the wax stamp and pressing it into place on the now sealed page. The chapter resolved the immediate spectacle, and the field's tally grew by 1. Midday swarmed the tally experiment. A peasant shouted, and the field warden slammed his palm on the wooden post. The unnamed prisoner jerked his head and swallowed, fear tightening his throat. Sun struck his forehead, and the rim of packed earth pressed against the teeth of his jaw. The narrator notes the time, the tally marks, and the sound of flies rising from dried skin. Within the first minutes, the central conflict is visible. This is not punishment alone, but a staged test with recorded outputs and sanctioned extension. The prisoner's fear dictates the first small choices. He keeps his gaze fixed on the horizon and admits no plea. The midday line had lengthened from the dusk row the narrator recorded days earlier, when the same prisoner had spat dry sand from his mouth and braced against the earthen rim. Now, under a harsher light, those earlier motions mattered. The field warden walked the line with a wooden tally stick in his free hand and the same mechanical pace. The prisoner's hands scraped against packed soil. His breathing shortened. Doubt arrived next. He tried to remember whether the magistrate had spoken names or laws the morning arrests were read, and whether his own number had been circled. That doubt hardened into calculation. He moved his fingers and tested the weight of the clay rim. He measured how far his toes could flex beneath the soil. The narrator records these measurements with an unemotional cadence. The narrator does not look away when the magistrate's messenger enters the canvas tent on the field edge and produces a folded parchment. The messenger's arrival is an external event that changes procedure. The magistrate's seal requires a later exposure time. The field warden reads the instruction, taps a fresh notch into his tally, and adjusts the schedule. The prisoner hears the paper rustle and understands by the warden's thumb that the sequence will continue longer than expected. Suspicion shifts toward a new, colder certainty. The burial is now a formal experiment. Keep them at number 5 until sunset. The field warden, voice flat, number 5. The magistrate repeated, writing into a ledger. The prisoner felt his throat tighten into a hard knot. He tried to cough it into dust. He tried to swallow the question. Why lengthen an already deliberate death? He had no answer. The narrator notes the bureaucratic language used, duration, observed endpoints, and records the faces that do not show hesitation. As the sun climbed, flies clustered at the hairline where soil met skin. The second emotional shift came as physical revulsion. The prisoner slapped at his temple with a hand that barely moved. He inhaled grit and the stink of sweat. His mouth tasted of clay. He blinked bloodshot eyes and tried to catch the field warden's glance. The warden kept looking forward and made a small mark on his forearm with black ink. The prisoner recognized the series of notches. Months of watching the warden had taught him to read those marks the way other men read faces. Each notch corresponded to a measured interval and an outcome. A peasant walked the dusty track near the burial line and paused. The prisoner saw the peasant slow and reach into a pouch for a rag, probably to swat flies. Hope made his hand curl around the frayed bead at his throat. He directed the bead's cord in a tiny motion toward the passerby. This was an attempt, a separate external event that might change what followed. The peasant met the field warden's eyes and stepped back. The warden's look contained no temptation, no bargaining. The peasant swallowed and turned away. Peasant, I didn't he know, field warden, you know now. Step away. The prisoner pressed his forehead harder to the rim of soil and tried to breathe evenly. Desperation replaced the earlier doubt. He spat a small mouthful of sand from his teeth. He kept his eyes fixed on a thin line of sky. The flies bit in more insistent patterns. Where skin had been raw the first day, small pustules broke open. Maggots were not yet visible, but an odor of rot began to rise in the warmth. A magistrate appeared again at the tent's flap and called the warden over. The narrator follows their motions without commentary. The magistrate's face is flat. His hand moves to a ledger and copies the warden's tallies into an official column. They talk in short sentences. The warden taps 2 more notches on his forearm. The prisoner watches the inked marks and understands that the tally is not only record, keeping but the experiment's spine. He thinks of earlier nights when officers debated methods in low tents and the field's rules grew teeth. Field warden, record time, note reaction, move to number 6 if necessary, magistrate, document the interval. We need consistent data. The prisoner mouthed a sound that might have been a name. The narrator writes, the prisoner tried to signal. The trial expounds the emotional field. Fear slides into anger. He pulls at his frayed rope mark until the cord bites. He tries to lock the warden with his eyes and fails when the warden does not look down. He tries to shout, but his voice comes out raw and short. The warden places his palm against the post and makes a deliberate noise, a rhythm that matches earlier sessions. The field's cadence reduces men to results. The mid-chapter twist arrives in a small, concrete packet, a tally mark miscount. A soldier steps away from the warden, then returns with a scratched stone. He points to the warden's forearm and says that a notch has been smeared, doubling 1 interval. The warden frowns and runs his thumb over dried ink. The magistrate leans in and reads the ledger again. Suddenly the measured durations are suspect. What had been presented as precise becomes demonstrably subject to human error. The prisoner hears this and surges with a new impulse, hope that the error will save him. Soldier, warden, 1 notch is smeared, field warden, correct it. Note the smear. Proceed, magistrate, we will add a corrective entry. Continue observation. That exchange is an external event that produces a mini cliffhanger. Will the correction shorten the exposure or extend it further? The choice belongs to the magistrate and the warden. They decide to proceed and add more observation. The prisoner's hope halts and becomes a hot, physical ache. The afternoon proceeds with small, hurtful increments. Insects multiply around hairlines and ear canals. The prisoner jerks when a beetle lands on his lip. He tries to scrape it away and coughed thick mucus that tasted of metal. He hears the distant scrape of a quill in the magistrate's tent. The warden's tallying becomes a percussion beat against the field. A peasant returns later, and this time watches long enough to mark the time in his memory. He whispers to himself and takes one slow step away. The narrator notes how the peasant's presence alters the scene. A witness forms a durable impression. At mid-afternoon, a circle of black wings appears on the far horizon. Vultures ride a rising thermal and then bank toward the burial line. Their arrival is sudden and external. All heads turn. The prisoner tenses and flexes his fingers, trying to pull against packed soil. He manages a grunt and a half lurch, enough to draw the warden's attention. The warden steps forward, plant in hand, and pushes the rim to repack the dirt. The peasant moves closer, then freezes under the warden's cold look. Peasant, stop. Field warden, back away. The prisoner reaches with both hands and feels soil give under his nails. His shoulder scrapes against the rim. A vulture descends and pecks at exposed scalp. The prisoner screams in a short, broken sound. The warden grabs a rope and pulls the prisoner down by the cord at his neck. The peasant lunges between them, and the warden slams the peasant's shoulder with the flat of his hand. A rapid fight breaks out. The peasant strikes for the warden. The warden shoves the peasant to the ground. Shouts scatter across the field. This confrontation is the chapter's climax, the beat where physical violence collides with recorded procedure. Field warden, you interfere and you die like them. Peasant, there is breathing. You can pull him free! The warden's hand finds the tully stick and knocks the peasant's arm. The magistrate stumbles out of the tent and calls for order. Soldiers move to restrain the peasant. The narrator records the scene. The peasant is dragged back. The prisoner is forced still. The vulture returns and pecks again. The warden marks another notch on his forearm. The magistrate writes the new outcome into his ledger as a fact to be noted. The prisoner convulses. Fever rises in waves that make him shiver against the sun. His tongue swells against his teeth and he drools a salty paste. He tries to speak and manages a few words that come out like broken shells. Unnamed prisoner, they watch the time. They watch the time, documentary narrator. They record the elapsed intervals and the visible reactions. They test thresholds. The narrator's tone is flat, but the content reveals the twist. The burial functions as collected data. The magistrate looks up and tilts his head. He asks the prisoner one rapid question. What did they hope to learn? The prisoner coughs and produces a single, hollow clause. Unnamed prisoner, which animals come first? Which burns, which stops? That admission changes the field's meaning. The magistrate scribbles faster. The warden's face tightens for the first time. The peasant sobs. The soldier half turns away. The narrator writes the names into the record and notes the shift in motive from public punishment to controlled observation. After the struggle, dusk eases like a physical lowering of a canvas. The warden lifts the prisoner from the pit and drags him to the edge. He is hollowed and fevered. The narrator notes each bruise and each coagulated spot. The magistrate orders a basic wash. The peasant kneels on the dirt and offers a scrap of cloth. The soldier helps lift the prisoner, and the narrator watches all hands as they work. The same hands that earlier drove stakes now lift the body for a new purpose. The peasant insists on staying to watch the recovery. He whispers to the prisoner words that are not recorded in the ledger. Peasant, tell them you saw nothing. Tell them you saw nothing, unnamed prisoner. They will write it down anyway. The prisoner gives the narrator a single fragmented confession, the scene's final external beat. He says the experimenters kept notes on how long exposure produced which reactions. He says they were testing thresholds not for law, but for a report that would be argued over in rooms far from the field. He coughs and the spit tastes of iron. The narrator copies the words and pauses only to check the pistolate measure of time on his small, worn watch. The night moves over them, and the magistrate folds his ledger closed. The narrator ends the chapter by recording a precise image. A guttering candle in the tent, a cracked clay bowl set aside, and the magistrate tucking the folded parchment under the ledger with a careful thumb. The surviving prisoner is carried toward the recovery spot as soldiers lower a canvas flap. The warden updates his tally with a slow, indifferent motion. The peasant leaves with dirt in his nails and a look that will not be erased. The chapter closes on the narrator copying the prisoner's last line into the official notes. They had wanted to know what bodies taught them. The final paragraph contains no reflection on fate or new purpose. It ends on an action. The magistrate snaps the ledger shut. The narrator lays the copied line beside it and stands to fold the tent flap. The flap falls into place as the soldiers arrange their ropes. Pre-dawn reckoning final tally. The cart's wheel snapped against packed earth, and a voice barked, "Stop, count," before the sun rose. Fear sat behind the unnamed prisoner's teeth. He lifted his head because the field warden's thumb pressed the rim of dirt against his jaw. Fear spurred the prisoner to measure the horizon with his eyes and not beg. This fear would steer his hands and keep him from speaking unless spoken to. The cart door opened, and the traveling magistrate stepped down, cloak wet with dew. The caravan healer unrolled a stained cloth and set a small leather case on the inspection table. The field warden tapped his wooden tally stick on his palm and said, "Rows 3 and 4 ready." The magistrate walked the pits. People in the line tightened their grips on earth and grit crept into eyes and mouths. The narrator recorded the arrival without effect. He wrote the time, the tally patterns, and the field warden's reply. "I follow the directive." That phrase came twice in the first 5 minutes. The narrator's unemotional entries tracked procedure, but the scene before him was argument, not mere bureaucracy. The traveling magistrate bent and read tally marks, then unfolded a sealed scrap and frowned. "This extends the orders." A ledger entry from the provincial overseer. He did not raise his voice. The field warden answered, "We keep the line as instructed." The magistrate tapped the paper to the edge of the wooden table and placed the ledger beside it. The caravan healer moved down the row, hands careful and practical. He knelt at one pit and looked at the unnamed prisoner. "Give him water," the healer said to the magistrate without waiting for permission. The field warden stepped between them and unclipped an iron ring from his belt. His voice was low, clipped. "Not my choice." The healer pressed his palms together and pushed with his shoulder against the rim, trying to slip a water skin into reach. The prisoner, eyes bloodshot, clutched the carved bead at his throat. The bead was smoothed by dirt and sweat. He rubbed it with a thumbwork that trembled. The motion showed a person bargaining with an object because bargaining with law had failed him. He nothing allowed. His mouth tasted of dry sand, the same dry sand he had spat out days earlier when the tally stick tapped nearby. The magistrate read aloud from the folded note, a directive for continued observation. Note: measure insect activity, note time to collapse, keep sample heads exposed for 3 days. The caravan healer's hands tightened on the water skin. 3 days. He repeated, "You mean 3 more days of this?" The field warden's gaze slid to the healer and he answered, "Orders from above." The narrator recorded the exchange in a short line. "Orders over lives." Emotion shifts occurred in quick succession. At first the mood was pragmatic compliance, the magistrate checking marks, the warden counting bodies. Then moral friction rose when the healer knelt. The healer's hands worked on the rope knot at the prisoner's neck while speaking, and his voice carried urgency now. "Caravan healer," he said, "loosen the knot. Lower his head an inch. He needs water." The field warden moved a step back and tightened his hand on the wooden tally stick. "No," he said. "Ritual demands no lowering." The ledger is specific. The healer pushed back. This is not ritual. It is death by convenience. Their exchange sparked a second emotion shift. Doubt in procedure became anger at ritual. The magistrate held up one finger and opened the ledger. He traced entries with a forefinger stained by ink. "There is a sealed column I didn't expect," he told the field warden. "This mentions an experiment directive by name." The field warden's jaw set. "I did what I was told," he said. "My marks here are accurate." "The tali is not mine to change." The caravan healer snapped a small knife and worked at the frayed rope while the prisoner flinched. The prisoner tried to wedge his hand forward to the bead. The healer's fingers brushed the rope. The field warden shoved his shoulder forward, knocking the healer's forearm. The healer's lips pressed into a thin line and he spat. "You will kill him for rules," the field warden answered. "We keep order." "I mark what I must." Their voices rose into a short argument that snapped like twine. Rapid back and forth followed. "Loosen it, warden," the healer demanded. "You do your tali and he dies. I do not decide," the field warden orders.
"Then show the order,"
the healer said. "Show the seals." The magistrate flipped the sealed scrap again. The ledger was signed by a name I'd done to recognize, he said. "It references tests approved by a committee in the provincial office." He paused and tapped ash into his palm. "We must document." "We must not alter," the healer glared at the magistrate. "Document. Is that what you call it when someone drowns in sun and insects?" He moved to jab the ledger with his thumb. The magistrate batted his hand away without raising his voice. Within moments, the conflict became physical. The prisoner twisted his shoulders and tried to push his head lower. He strained at the rope while grunting. The healer shoved at the soil rim with one knee to reach the knot. The field warden grabbed the healer's wrist, and the tali stick knocked against the edge of the table. Dirt slid down the prisoner's cheek with sweat. A new external event. The magistrate found a ledger entry that named a superior official and a sealed mark. He pointed to it. "It is sanctioned at a higher level," he said. The healer's hands fell away from the rope. "Then this is not yours to end," the field warden, softer. "I obey the sanction." The prisoner stopped struggling for a beat and breathed through his nose, eyes wide in a fixed focus on the horizon. The narrator recorded the procedural language, sanctioned and observe, but also logged the physical consequences. The prisoner's lips cracked, flies clustered at the damp of his eyes, and his right hand spasmed. The caravan healer, named Alias in regional records, rubbed his thumb over the bead and said, "Alias will not watch you die if I can help it." He tried again to free the knot. The field warden tightened his other hand on the tali stick and barked, "Step back." The healer answered with a clipped, "No." The two circled each other with different currencies. Medicine and law. The narrator's tone remained clinical, listing times and actions, but action moved the scene. A scuffle, a kneel, a ledger flip, a sealed directive exposed. That exposure produced a sudden twist. The sealed note contained an amendment that extended the experiment across multiple sites, naming places and times and specifying insect sampling as part of the measure. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. He read the list aloud while the field warden traced each place with a finger. The prisoner heved and uttered a sound that was not a word. It was a small animal noise. The healer, while kneeling, pressed a cupped hand to the prisoner's brow. "Water," he said. The field warden watched the motion, then spoke to the magistrate. "If I lower him 1 inch, the pattern breaks." The magistrate did not answer at once. He scanned the ledger for an instruction that allowed mercy. He found none. Another external event occurred. A caravan assistant stepped from the cart and announced a tali anomaly. A corpse in pit 5 showed puncture marks inconsistent with natural bites. The field warden frowned and pointed to the corpse, while the magistrate bent to inspect punctures. The magistrate asked, "Yes," the warden said, "different species indicated." "We note time and mark," the narrator wrote the record. The healer hissed under his breath and said, "They use it as a variable. They test which insects they can weaponize. The field warden's face did not change. The prisoner, hearing the healer's words, went rigid. He tried to push a foot under the rim and to shove his hand forward for the bead. His breathing grew more shallow and faster. The field warden moved to restrain his foot. The healer struck the warden's arm, and a short scrape of metal rang as the iron bracelet hit the tally stick. The prisoner cried out a consonant noise that cut the morning air. The magistrate closed the ledger and said, "I will record this finding and send a dispatch." "Names, times," the field warden simply. "Do so." The healer lashed out with a short list of demands. "Unchain him. Give him water. Note the wounds properly." The magistrate nodded and called for a scribe to copy the sealed entry into the official register. That action changed the choreography of authority. Documentation had moved from passive record to active justification. Another emotion shift. The prisoner's resignation altered into a small surge of hope when the magistrate suggested dispatch. He strained and whispered through cracked lips, "Magistrate." The magistrate bent and said, "Speak up, prisoner." The prisoner croaked, "My name, remember bead." He swallowed, "Remember bead." He tried to indicate the bead with a trembling index. The healer tucked a thumb into his palm and said, "Elias will note the bead." "Ayers will take it." The field warden glared and said, "You will not remove evidence." The healer answered, "It is his name. It is his mark of who he was. It is not evidence of experiment." The argument slowed but did not stop the tension. The climactic beat arrived when the magistrate hesitated over the ledger, and then, under pressure from the field warden, did not issue an order for removal. He instead sealed the notation and signed with a terse mark. The field warden straightened and announced, "Line stays." He raised the tally stick and tapped it 3 times to mark the choice. The prisoner sagged. The healer grabbed the prisoner's wrist and forced water into his mouth with both hands while the field warden watched. The prisoner choked and coughed. Some water spilled into his hair and attracted more flies. In the scramble that followed, the healer yelled, "You cannot," and the field warden cut him off. "Enough," said the warden, "we will keep the line. The magistrate has written the seal." The healer threw down his knife and stabbed his palm with the knife's dull edge in a quick, empty gesture of anger. "Elias will remember this," he said, staring at the field warden. The warden did not look away. The narrator described the final enforcement precisely. The field warden ordered the line kept. He barked that any lowering would violate the protocol. The traveler magistrate put the ledger back into the cart. He did not argue. He mounted the cart and called for a scribe to draft a dispatch. The caravan wheels turned a fraction as if testing the road. The prisoner lay back against the rim of packed earth. Sweat ran from his temple into the dirt and flies settled along the wet trail. An unexpected but concrete reveal followed. The magistrate, in a whisper to the field warden, while the scribe copied the seal, named the official who had signed the directive. A commander in the provincial office whose insignia matched a waxed stamp at the ledger's edge. The field warden's shoulders dropped for a breath and then stiffened. He will answer for the order. The field warden, but the voice lacked conviction. The traveler moved on and left the longer chain of command implied by the waxed stamp. After the enforcement, the caravan healer stayed near the prisoner's face and worked with compresses. The prisoner blinked and focused on the healer's hand. He mumbled, "Bead, remember." The healer, while adjusting the compress, slid the bead into his palm and closed his fingers around it. The narrator recorded the exchange clinically and then noted the healer's action. He wrapped the bead in cloth and placed it in his satchel. Days later, the narrator would file a survivor fragment, a short statement written by the prisoner in a shaky hand after he was removed from the line. It read, "I do not know the name of the man who signed the paper. I remember a bead and a horizon. I spat sand and tasted metal." The narrator kept that sentence as an evidentiary entry. The bead and the survivor's fragment tied the singular body to a system. In the chapter's last hours, the caravan left a paper dispatch, and the field warden marked a final tally. The tally stick snapped with a dull crack as he added a notch. The healer pressed his palm to the prisoner's cheek and whispered a name. "You are not only a line," he said. The prisoner blinked and tried to speak, but his lips could not form more than a broken breath. The healer packed the bead into a small leather wrap and set it in his satchel in a place where the narrator later listed it as evidence. The narrator closed the record with objective phrases, time-logged, signatures, tally marks. He also recorded the small human gestures. The healer's thumb rubbing the bead, the prisoner's finger pressing an imprint into damp cloth, the field warden's steady marking. The final paragraph of the chapter ends not on a reflection, but on a situational beat. The magistrate ordered the cart to move. The cart's wheel ground dust into the pit rim. The field warden tapped the tally stick, and the caravan healer slid his hand into his satchel, fingers closing over the wrapped bead. Emotion root. Fear defined the prisoner's actions. It pushed him to measure the horizon and to clutch the bead rather than beg. Emotion shifts. Fear became guarded hope when the magistrate inspected the ledger. Hope collapsed into outrage when the field warden enforced the line. Outrage settled into a cold record that the narrator kept. Those shifts show through action. The prisoner straining, the healer kneeling, the warden's thumb on a tally stick, the magistrate signing with a clipped stroke. Dialogue drives facts and conflict. Action resolves the small moral contest of the chapter. This chapter ties to earlier events. The unnamed prisoner had spat dry sand in a previous dusk, and the field warden had tapped his tally stick nearby as recorded in Chapter 1. The midday swarm noted earlier continued to be a variable. Corpse punctures were rechecked and noted in the ledger as anomalies, confirming attempts to quantify insect effects described in Chapter 2. The final tally here completes that chain. A higher, sanctioned directive extended the experiment, the field warden enforced procedure, and the caravan healer preserved a single human token, the carved bead, to prove the person behind the tally. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The line was kept, the prisoner nearly died but was later removed, and the recorder filed a notation that implied bureaucratic culpability. The secondary characters influenced outcomes. The field warden enforced orders. The traveling magistrate provided the paperwork that justified enforcement. The caravan healer tried to intervene and preserved the bead. Listeners can recall at least 3 names now in context. The field warden bureaucratic enforcer, the traveling magistrate paper authority, and the caravan healer Elias practical rescuer, each with distinct motivations and actions. A small twist remained. The ledger named a commander in the provincial office whose stamp matched the sealed scrap. That revelation shifted the moral weight away from local cruelty to a sanctioned program, altering how observers recorded blame. The chapter ends on a concrete beat. The cart's wheel ground away from the rim, the field warden added his notch, and the caravan healer closed his fingers over the wrapped bead as witnesses watched the dust settle.